So we are thrilled to have all three of you here to share your research with us. Bess, I hand the microphone over to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Jim, for that warm introduction. We are just delighted to share this work with the attendees and the ALPINE community. Greetings from snowy Lansing, Michigan. Although you'll see my background, I am dreaming of my trail runs during my postdoc in the Clemson Experimental Forest, a really large part of my connection with the Clemson community during that time. I'm just going to give a brief overview of where we're going, and then I'm going to hand it to Kim for our introduction of the material. But we're going to go through just in broad terms a paper that we wrote looking at this issue about relevance and connection with school forests. And then Bill is going to present an in-depth case study from University of Vermont. And then we're going to really invite some participation and questions and discussions about your interactions with these forests and their directions. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kim.
Great, thank you. So first I want to just give a nod to the interdisciplinary team that worked on this project. It really was a collaborative effort among a group of scholars that were coming from different fields. So you can see here that we had myself, who focuses on forest planning, Bess, who focuses on protected areas, and then we had a range of postdocs and students that study ecosystem dynamics, cultural ecosystem services, forestry, and cliff ecology. And then Bill, of course, who is here, and another former faculty member from UVM who's interested in forest health, and as well as the natural lands manager at UVM, so the person who actually manages the school forest. So this really was an interdisciplinary team that represented both natural sciences and sort of human dimensions of forestry. We were all lucky enough to be at UVM at the same time. And the reason that we all came together to write this paper is that we were all engaged around this McIntyre-Stennis project that was looking at the multiple different dimensions of the school research forests at UVM. And we wanted to try to scale that work up and think about what it looked like in a broader context across the research. So you can see here, we've done a description of what that McIntyre-Stennis project was. And as we were sort of thinking about what might it be like to scale that work up, I had started reflecting on an experience that I had while I was a PhD student at Virginia Tech. And to give you an example of that, to sort of tell the story a little bit, I'm gonna share with you a video, and we're just gonna do about half the video, but hopefully this will give you a glimpse into my motivation for thinking about this paper.
This is a native forest, and what we're seeing are the processes that take place in native forests. And if you're learning how to promote the health of a forest, or to regenerate it, or even to harvest it sustainably, you have to have intact forests in order to learn this. Having an old-growth forest on the central campus of a university is just an incredible resource. How many schools have the opportunity to teach students tree identification, tree health, tree management in an old-growth forest within walking distance of the dormitories and the regular classrooms, which is what we have here. And in this case, we're looking at a dendrology class that is probably having their midterm exam right now, as we speak. And hopefully they all did well. Hello. Just a typical day here at Stadium Woods.
There's untold research that could be done on an old growth forest that is just central to our university's reason for being, is education and research.
So this is black snake root. We never even knew that this existed in the woods until after the first year when we pulled invasives. I can't tell you what a boost this was for us to realize that our work in controlling invasives could lead to restoration of this forest. But at the same time, what we're restoring was as much as a surprise as learning that these trees were hundreds of years older than we ever thought they would be. So this paper represents the 11,000 people who signed a petition calling for the woods to be preserved. And it's our responsibility to remind everybody that the number one thing that we called for still has not taken place, which is preservation of the woods.
For me, I think the woods are just a really special.
So the video goes on and you get to hear a whole bunch of different people talk about why Stadium Woods is so important to them and so special for them. You hear a medical doctor talking about, you know, being able to go there in between seeing patients. You hear researchers, you hear students. I wanted to share that because it was really formative for me in sort of inspiring this paper. So sort of at the same time that we were thinking about wanting to sort of scale up the work of this McIntyre-Stennis project, I was remembering this experience about the potential development of this woods and the community rallying to try to protect it and try to save it. So that's what motivated the work that we're going to talk about today. So, you know, in looking at the survey results that you all filled out ahead of this webinar, it's clear that many of you interact with school forests. Your work is directly connected with them. Maybe many of you know this, but school forest, and when I use that term, I mean a forest owned by a college or a university or institution of higher education. They have a long history in the United States. The first one was founded in the late 1800s. It is now part of Adirondack Park. It's sort of an interesting history there. I encourage you all to go investigate Cornell's early School of Forestry. But school forests have been part of the fabric of our landscape for a long time, and many of them share a common three-pronged mission. So it's very common for them to have missions that emphasize research, education, and demonstration. And in addition to that, many of them have quite a bit of ecological significance. So Bill is going to talk more about this later when he gives a case study, but just as a few examples, the University of Florida, the Austin Carey Memorial Forest has been noted as, you know, one of the most important habitats for federally endangered woodpecker. The University of Mississippi has one of the most important remaining examples of longleaf pine in the country. So these places often represent really critical ecological locations. And Bill's going to talk about this a little bit more too, but we don't really have a great sense of the total number of school forests across the United States or their acreage. So in 1985, there was a census of accredited forest programs in the United States. And at that time, 44 institutions of higher education owned about a collective 250,000 acres of land in the form of school forests. They play important function in terms of habitat connectivity and forest blocks. So they're providing a whole range of ecosystem services, as we'll get into.
So we really wanted to look at school forests and what they contain and how people connect with them. And that meant for our for our investigation, we really looked at two frameworks simultaneously, that of ecosystem services and that of relevance. And so I'd just like to give you a little handhold in each of those so that we can talk about them together. So ecosystem services, as you may be aware, are characteristics and processes given of a given natural environment that support human life. And we can have all sorts of biophysical ecosystem services, provisioning, regulating, and supporting services. These would be examples like food production, such as maple syrup or mushrooms, climate regulation, and nutrient cycling. We also have a host of cultural ecosystem services, and you can see that as the bottom half of this table here. And these are about ways in which people get benefits from these forests as well. And so when we're thinking about ecosystem services, we can look across these different types of services, the biophysical and the cultural, and think about it as a tool to see which benefits accrue and flow from an ecosystem to society. When we think about ecosystem services in this way, we don't see them necessarily verbatim in the missions of school forests, but we see them so much evidenced in the practices. So the three-prong mission that Kim was just discussing really emphasizes ecosystem services and also their broader contributions. So thinking about what benefits are in the forest itself, and then who is connecting with those benefits in our larger society. As Kim mentioned, our latest census of these places is going on 30 years old now, and it's incomplete. But just to give you a couple examples of some of these, we have this picture at the top from Harvard Forest, and they really did some early work on the impact of land use and natural disturbance on New England forests, and now really do a lot on biodiversity studies, conservation management, modeling of ecosystems, and carbon exchange. So that's a host of ecosystem services in itself. And that bottom picture from UVM's Jericho forest, really we see contributions in the Jericho forest to graduate studies and opportunities for students to observe and practice forestry techniques and silvicultural demonstrations, and ideas about education more broadly, with practitioners also finding ways to interact with and learn from these forests. The second framework that we looked at is that of how are we connecting with these places? What are those tangible connections to these? So this is the idea of relevance, and relevance is all about those meaningful connections. So inclusive practices that really broaden and deepen the way that we connect with a place, or the way that we see its usefulness or applicability to our own lives. And when we talk about these meaningful connections, a lot of times we need to be really specific. And so past work has really looked at how to build relevant connections with very specific audiences and on specific topics. We feel that the cultural ecosystem services framework, these 10 common expressions of ecosystem services, such as recreation, spiritual connection, artistic inspiration, although it's incomplete, it's really a nice succinct way of looking at where we can establish relevance with diverse audiences. And it also gives some practical implications too. When a forest has greater relevance, we may have a broader base of stewards for conservation advocacy. So in this way, when we think about relevance with school forests, we really encourage managers to identify common goals with these audiences, be they administrators, students, the local communities, broader communities of practice, and then take these related actions, incorporating their perspectives of the audiences into the goals. And that way we can have broad connections where we're reaching multiple audiences, and also deep connections where you may be attending a program and relating to multiple points of contact in that. And so I won't get too much more into the broad and the deep areas of relevance, but I encourage you to think about a forest that you cherish, that you hold dear, and to think about who else holds that forest dear. And is there one particular reason you connect with that forest, or many? So relevance allows us to have a lens on how school forests might be perceived, and whether or not there's ecosystem services provided. And relevance is also an increasing imperative across land management agencies and all different types of protected areas, of which I would classify school forests as one type. We see there's a long history of thinking about relevance and community connection. So we can go back to that early example that Kim mentioned of the Cornell forest, and that actually it was defunded due to public outcry about its management. We have a quote there from the Journal of Forestry that harkens on this from 115 years ago, all the way through to present day, where in the late 90s and early aughts, we had the University of Mississippi looking to do leases for logging, and Virginia Tech and Clemson considering sales for development. And in these later cases, public opposition, taking these forests to be a public good and rallying for that public good, really stepped in and stopped those harvests and sales, indicating that there was a relevant connection felt by large audiences that then put pressure on ceasing these sales. So the takeaway point from this is that public participation matters, and school forest relevance matters, and it may lead to community groups advocating against or for protection, depending on how relevant a forest is. So, so keeping in mind these two frameworks, really how we centered this paper is looking at these objectives of how critical cultural ecosystem services are in motivating public engagement, driving decision making, and informing planning. And that we suspect that cultural ecosystem services are many and great on these forests, but they are less documented in the academic literature. And administrators really look to the academic literature as a major information source. And so the paucity of this information may be a missed relevance connection in a way to emphasize these forests' utility and connection to many audiences. So therefore, our main objective in this work was really to explore the relevance of school forests, particularly as conveyed by sources that are likely consumed by school administrators when they're thinking about how to delegate institutional resources, how to do management plans, and where to prioritize efforts. So this meant really looking in the academic literature and the prevalence and diversity of ecosystem services attributed to forests.
Okay, so I'm going to talk through our process for the systematic literature review. As Beth said, we were really interested in material that we believed administrators might consume. And so we sort of reasoned that many college administrators were faculty in a previous lifetime, were a scientist at some point, and they place a high currency on academic material. And so for that reason, we focused on refereed publications, books, theses and dissertations, conference proceedings, technical reports like Forest Service general technical reports, and sort of gray literature that would fit within this category of academic work. We once we agreed upon the types of sources that we were going to look at, we collaboratively came up with a range of search terms to try to find any academic work that would implicate, would talk about, would include a university or college owned forest. So here are the search terms that we used. We entered these into 3 databases: Web of Science, Google Scholar, and Agricola. And then as you'll see on the next screen, we went through a whole screening process to sort of figure out, what's in and what's out. So the search took place in the spring of 2018. Based on the search that I just described, we got quite a few hits. And so our first cut was to remove anything that didn't actually talk about a university-owned forest or something that happened outside the United States. So we constricted our study to the United States. My apologies to the Canadian folks that are with us today. And anything that wasn't in English that we weren't able to read and review. We downloaded everything that was available for access based on that initial cut. We additionally had to get some things through interlibrary loan. There were some really cool old works that I would encourage everyone again to try to check out that early forest at Cornell, because Cornell did a really awesome job at archiving everything. And so we got some cool older archival documents through interlibrary loan. And then we did a deep dive on that 207 pieces of work that sort of made the cut as being relevant. And we, from there, excluded an additional 77 works, mostly if it, didn't really focus on school forest or work done on a school forest. It just had like a mention of it in passing, but it really, wasn't the meat of the paper. And that resulted in 130 final pieces of literature that we entered into a manuscript database for analysis and coding. So this is, just sort of a quick look at what that database looks like. All of the works entered with all of their information. And then from there, that database got imported into NVivo software, which is a qualitative research software. It's really well suited for mixed methods research. And I was able to then use that software to qualitatively code all of the works for common themes, patterns, and then connections between those. So as a group, we developed, those of you who are not familiar with qualitative coding, as a group, we developed what's called a priori coding structure. So this is, a group of codes or themes that we might expect to see when going through the papers. We base these on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, because as Beth said, we're using these ecosystem services as a framework for thinking about the work. And then we added actually an additional 2 more codes to that, which you'll see in a minute. And then we also added codes around sort of the audience of the paper. Was it geared towards other scientists? Was it geared towards students? Was it geared towards administrators? And went through and systematically coded these papers for these different themes that we expected to see, and then also coded them for themes that emerged that we didn't necessarily expect to see. The way NVivo has a function that's very useful that allows you to check for reliability. And so everyone can code, and then the same document can be coded multiple times by multiple researchers, and then the program will do a reliability check. So even though this is a subjective application of the codes, there's a way to ensure that at least the research team is in agreement and that you are indeed measuring what you're seeking to measure. So we checked for intercoder reliability using that platform in the software. And then we also just met regularly and talked through any inconsistencies. So if somebody coded something as, you know, one CES, but someone else coded it as something else, we would have a meeting to discuss, like, what is this really? We need to make sure that our coding is valid. And so you can see that our works represent or name school forests across the country, and you can see where they're concentrated. One note that I will make is that the map that is displayed here and that is in our paper, it is a representation of what the papers reported on. So keep in mind that this was a lit review, right? We didn't go out and attempt to do a census of the school forests that currently exist across the United States. And so if somebody reported a name and that name has since changed, or two papers reported the same forest but under different names, that is represented in the map. We would love to return to the question of a complete and accurate census later. But the first big takeaway is that our representation of school forests across the country is really concentrated, as you can see, in the eastern US. That's what's consistently being reported on in the papers that we reviewed. And there's, you know, some forests were left out. So there are school forests that we know exist, that we know have a lot of research happening, and they didn't show up in this lit review. And we'll talk about why we think that might be in a little bit. We also saw potentially a unsurprising distribution of the ecosystem services that are named. So I at least was unsurprised that cultural ecosystem services, so those sort of intangible benefits that people get from nature, things like artistic inspiration, life teaching, education, those things were mentioned less. And perhaps unsurprisingly, foundational science, especially in some of those early papers, that was really the meat of what we found in the lit review.
So besides the forest that we found papers referring to and those major themes of ecosystem services, and again, you know, Kim is right in noting that the two that we found the most information on were foundational science and biodiversity, which actually we coded for in addition to the other ecosystem services, and cultural ecosystem services were at the far end there of the representation. But who were these papers speaking to? Who was the audience? Who were they trying to make that connection with? Where are those strands of relevance coming in? Well, we coded for 5 audiences, thinking that these would be where we would see the majority of works coming. And we were also open to coding for additional audiences if we saw those represented. We did not. And what did we find? Well, scientists like to talk to each other. We found that the majority of them, more than half of the papers, were really talking to other practitioners and other scientists. Only 16% of them mentioned something about a community audience, and even fewer of them talked about a student audience, students at the university, students in K through 12 at the local community level, any of those. And when we try to see, okay, you know, we're making a connection with one audience, is this paper also trying to bridge connections with multiple audiences? We found even fewer of these. So we found that about a third of the papers, a quarter to a third of the papers spoke to 2 audiences, and these were primarily practitioners and scientists. Only 9% talked to 3 audiences, and this would be, you know, practitioners, scientists, and some mention of community members. And across our whole data set of 130 works, only 2 works talk to the 4 audiences of practitioners, scientists, community members, and students. And harking in on our ideas about, you know, administrators relying on these types of references in their decision making, we found that none of the works spoke specifically to forest administrators or institutes of higher education administrators. So what does this all mean? I would like to pose what we consider some big takeaway points for you to consider, and then Bill is going to do a deeper dive into the UVM context. The first is our map just represents what forests were named, and we understand so much more good work has been done on forests. So we implore people that when you are writing something about a study you have done or a work that you have done in a forest, to name that forest explicitly. And then also to explicitly name the benefits, not just to those who are your nearest neighbors academically or professionally, but publicizing the community benefits of the school forests. And of course, this is not appropriate in all situations. We're not making a blanket statement here, but please, where appropriate, consider publicizing those benefits. The disparity of ecosystem services versus cultural ecosystem services, we really feel we can encourage more social science in these school forests to complement the other work that's been done. And we would really ask that you consider opportunities to expand your teaching and demonstration to include cultural ecosystem services and other human dimensions work.
Okay, hello everyone. This is Bill speaking. I'm ready to go. So I'm just going to highlight a few things from a case study based in New England and focusing on some of University of Vermont's research forests in particular. So as Kim and Bess have both said already, our forests have a three-pronged mission, which is typical of many school forests, that being research, education, and demonstration. And recently, actually, the demonstration piece has really expanded into more of a community engagement, which, as our literature review showed, is both important and yet underreported in the literature. But what I want to mention here really is the particular role that school forests play in the sort of the broader context of science and research. So most of you are familiar with the 84 experimental forests and rangelands that are on National Forest System lands. So those include 76 experimental forests, 4 experimental rangelands, and 4 experimental watershed sites. So those are where certainly a very large percentage of foundational science and research is performed, but school forests provide this very interesting complementary role with respect to those experimental forests, and they fill a unique niche in many ways. Robin, we can advance to the next slide. So, for example, while experimental forests on National Forest System lands might be much larger in size, school forests across the country often include smaller parcels, and that's certainly the case of the University of Vermont's research forest systems. We have 4 research forests currently, and we own and operate and manage others cooperatively. And these tend to be smaller parcels, smaller sites, and yet they're particularly important for us in ways in which the experimental forests are not. We can go to the next slide. So whereas on experimental forests, there are often the opportunities to do large scale manipulations, paired watershed studies, that sort of thing, smaller school forests provide opportunities for smaller, often student-based projects, and they have a certain degree of nimbleness or flexibility in terms of opportunities for the university research community that experimental forests might not. The review and application permitting processes can be lengthier and more challenging on experimental forests, whereas at school forests, there's an opportunity to propose and implement a project within the space of a semester. And so this is really important both on the research side, but especially on the education side. This is just a map of some of the projects underway at one of our primary research forest, the Jericho Research Forest in Chittenden County of north central Vermont. We can go to the next slide. And so this is really important if we think about opportunities that faculty and graduate students might need and might want for trying somewhat more unconventional types of things or experimenting with new ideas that may or may not work. And this has certainly been the case for me, in which I had the benefit of school forests over the course of my career in Vermont to test, in this example, a new silvicultural approach that might have been harder to implement and to have approved and permitted somewhere else. But the school forest gave me the opportunity to try this. We can go on. And also having, so next slide. Yeah, and then having these sites close at hand on a school forest, of course, just facilitates that student involvement, both of undergraduates and graduate students. This is just an example of a study of fungal responses to that experimental silvicultural study that I just showed. And this was a student-led paper, an undergraduate honors thesis that was eventually published. And so again, we see this kind of marriage between the research and education objectives on school forests and providing that flexibility that maybe other types of ownerships might not have to such a degree. Okay, next slide. So those are important in terms of that research angle. They also, of course, provide opportunities for demonstrations and community engagements of all sorts and varieties, and including projects that might not really cut the mustard in terms of rigorous experimental design and replication and other sorts of things that would be required on an experimental forest or somewhere else, but might nevertheless have real community benefits in terms of demonstration value. This is just an example, again, on one of our research forests of B3, F3 hybrid American chestnut reintroductions, and demonstrating to landowners and forest managers in the region how that might look under a variety of different canopy conditions and following a variety of different silvicultural treatments. So again, research forests provide this very flexible opportunity for these types of demonstrations. We can go on to the next slide. Okay, so we've clearly made the case, I think, in the webinar tonight that school forests have this critical role for research and education and student involvement. And yet the literature review showed clearly that the types of studies that have been reported in the literature are skewed towards those biophysical types of studies. And yet it's becoming increasingly evident that school forests provide a really important service in terms of their conservation value. And we've talked a little bit about threats that some school forests might face. But I want to ask everyone to think a little bit about the history of school forests. Like, how did we get them? Where did they come from? And if we think about the time period in which many of them were acquired and established, so 1920s, 30s, 40s, maybe into the 50s, that was a time period when, our grandparents' generation, people were still largely living in cities or more compact towns and hamlets, and then of course a more rural landscape. Since that time, especially in parts of the upper Midwest or the lower Midwest and the Northeast, we've seen significant development of those rural areas. So subdivision, parcelization, rural sprawl, suburban development, and in many cases, what were once rural school forests are now essentially islands of open space within suburbanized or developed landscapes. That's certainly the case now increasingly for the UVM Jericho Research Forest that you're seeing right here. And so forests like that now have assumed a role that we might not have anticipated 80 years ago, which is that they are anchors of open space in otherwise increasingly developed landscapes. They also often fill an important niche then in this kind of urban to wildland gradient, particularly true in the case of the Jericho Forest in Vermont. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. I know we're running short on time, so I'm trying to move through this quickly. And that's clearly where an initiative like ALPINE can help tremendously. So by bringing together school managers and school forests from across the country, and really thinking about how those forests are interacting with the landscapes around them, we can begin to envision school forests as hubs or core areas that can connect to and network with other conserved nodes in the landscapes in which they reside. And this is just a map showing the location of the Jericho Research Forest at the center, and each of those blue arrows is an example of how we've linked that forest to some other initiative or conserved parcel somewhere else in that particular landscape. And then we can just click one more time, and you see how the Jericho Research Forest on the left of this map actually became an anchor for a larger landscape initiative called the Chittenden County's Uplands Project, in which there was an attempt to link together conserved lands across a larger landscape. And so more and more we see school lands then assuming this role as anchors then for larger landscape scale conservation projects, including regional conservation initiatives. And then just real quick in my last minute or two, we can go to the next slide. I mean, I just want to be sure and mention the numerous other examples of this type of thinking and this type of approach. So for example, in north central Connecticut, we see the Myers Forest playing a critical role in the Quiet Corners initiative that's been going on since 2010, and really thinking about that university-owned forest as an anchor to build partnerships with landowners and foresters throughout Connecticut and throughout this landscape. And then the next slide. And of course, the same is true of the long-standing history of landscape scale collaboration that has taken place around the Harvard Forest in north central Massachusetts. And you're seeing the landscape there that Harvard Forest is embedded within, but of course, that's part of the larger North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership that Harvard Forest has participated in since 1997, and really thinking then about that much larger landscape context and the role that university forests could play in helping to conserve at that scale. So these were just examples of how school forests then have assumed this larger significance for landscape and regional scale conservation that perhaps wasn't envisioned 100 or more years ago when many of these were first established. And we can go to my last slide to wrap up. Yeah, so we see then that each of these examples form anchors or are core open space areas within these larger regional conservation partnerships. And of course, we could find examples of this throughout the United States. This case study just happens to focus on the Northeast. And then actually there's one more slide. Right, so if we think about the future then, and we think about building off of the results of our literature review, that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of opportunity here for increased engagement at multiple scales, local, regional, national, in terms of conservation initiatives. And there is, in particular, this opportunity for better and broader reporting of these cultural ecosystem services and messages that would resonate with administrators to carry this message that these forests are important for more than just that foundational science research, but are increasingly important for their community value and their conservation values. So I'll just end right there. Thanks very much.
That's terrific, Bill. Thank you so much for that wrapping up of all of this hard work and insight. Before we get to the questions, and I want to make sure you can hear me. Bill, can you hear me? Just nod.
Yep.
Okay. I want to make two acknowledgments. One is I want to thank Marianne Jorgensen and Robin Austin, who are on the ALPINE team, who are here right now and working hard to keep everything running smoothly and organized. And we so appreciate their effort in organizing this webinar. And also I want to acknowledge the fact that all of this forestry actually, and university forests actually has roots that go back to people like George Perkins Marsh, who was a benefactor of the University of Vermont, Gifford Pinchot, the first director of the United States Forest Service, who helped to found the forestry school, now the School of the Environment at Yale, and Bob Marshall, who was a graduate of the Harvard Forestry School, which is now the Harvard Forest, who of course helped to lift the wilderness movement and establish huge protected lands in the west part of the United States. So we are standing, even if we're not always thinking about it, we're standing on the shoulders of giants here and doing what we're doing. And I think that the call to action that Bill just made is directly relevant to things that they wrote 100 years ago, 150 years ago, about being good stewards of the earth. Now, with that, let me ask a question and then move into some of the questions that are appearing on the Q&A section of the webinar. First of all, in the news today is an item from Yale that FedEx just gave a group of Yale schools, including the Yale School of the Environment, $100 million to open a center on nature-based climate solutions. And forests are central to the research that's going to be done. That points out that increasingly some of the great commercial interests in the United States are turning back to forests and to the natural environment for solutions to problems that we face today, that we've seen this winter in climate change. And they're looking for solutions. They're looking in part to forests and university forests for those solutions. Let me ask the three of you, have you begun to see that emergence of interest from these people outside the university? And if so, or even if not, are university forests and the research and communications efforts that are going on, community outreach efforts, commensurate with the challenge that we face?
I'm gonna let Bill give his take on that first.
Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, well, it's a great question. I'm sure every single person attending this webinar, would have an opinion on this and would probably have an example to share. I can only give you mine, which is that we have seen tremendous interest from conservation groups and land trusts and others in partnering with the university around conservation and around conservation easements on adjoining parcels and that sort of thing. So there's clearly an interest out there within the community. I will say that it's a difficult time for that right now at universities. Budgetary challenges that universities face, especially in this COVID era. And so we haven't always been able to respond to that interest and to act on those opportunities. And so I think that, looking at funding sources that would help universities develop those partnerships with land trusts and other groups would be a tremendous asset. But there's some real challenges that universities face, as we all know.
Great. Kim.
My perspective is that it varies by the type of university. So I'm thinking that there were a lot of sort of private interests when I was at Virginia Tech that I saw in terms of, collaborations to solve or address climate change and using the research facilities there. Now I'm at SUNY Plattsburgh, and our campus-owned forest is not an experimental research facility. There's research happening there, but it's not sort of managed the same or have the same designation as an experimental forest at an R1 university that has a lot of private business ties, for example, or industry ties. So I think there's probably quite a bit of variability depending on the type of university and also the type of forest at the university. So everyone saw the example of Stadium Woods at Virginia Tech and how that was considered for development for an athletic facility. That's not the university's experimental forest. The Fishburne experimental forest is managed extremely differently. It's gated, it's really run like a lab. And so I think there's probably a lot of variability in there depending on what type of university it is, how they look at the parcel, those
Sure.
factors.
Yeah. So let me ask about another part of university. I have, I think that's my computer, and I apologize. Somebody's trying to reach me over an internal communication network, but I'll just let that pass. We have a question from Victoria Lockhart, who asks, are we including forests? Okay, pardon that interruption. Are we including forests held by university endowments as investments in this kind of research? Because I think, as many of us are aware, universities own vast amounts of forest land that are sometimes not directly in communication with forestry departments.
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I see that there's another question in the chat that's related about Oak Ridge. So the answer to all of this is if it was named as a university forest by the paper, then it was included in the review. If the authors of the paper did not name it as such, then it was not included in the review. So we didn't do a dig where we tried to, look at, for example, grants and grant reports and see where research was conducted. It was up to the authors of the papers to identify the work that they did and the place that they did it. And that is the starting point that we had, because our interest was what are the stories that are getting told about school forests. And so if the authors didn't identify their research location as a university-owned forest, then there wasn't a story being told about that place, right? So if they named it, then yes, and if they didn't name it, then it wasn't included.
All right.
And I'll add 2 quick points to that. So, right, so we by and large did not include lands that are held in trust, which would have significantly expanded the area. And then the second obvious take home here is that name your forest in the paper, to convey that message to administrators and to demonstrate the value. Like, clearly we demonstrated that that's not being done consistently.
I think implicit in the question is there an opportunity to better understand the forests that universities do hold in their endowments and how they're managed? And I will leave that question right now unanswered. It's not part of the scope of your paper, but it's a very interesting question. So Dick and Crane has another related question, which is about relevance. You have made it very clear that university forests provide many ecosystem services, including relevance. How can a greater segment of the university be introduced and engaged to the services forests provide? Will universities take responsibility for informing their students and communities for recognizing and understanding forest ecosystem services? In light of human impacts on climate and forest, should this be a primary component of university education to all students? Big question, lots of ideas wrapped up into that, but let you respond.
Yeah, that's an excellent question or set of questions, Dickon, and I'll just respond to the first part of that and then kind of see where we go from there. But how can we make these places more relevant to at least more of the immediate community, the university community? And this is where I would really encourage those of us who have connections to these places to think about that idea of broad versus deep relevance. It may be out of our scope or a next step to try to think about audiences beyond who we're currently connecting with. So what might be more feasible are some collaborations with those in communication, those within other disciplines of social science. For those, if you're a social scientist in the more natural science disciplines, to be thinking about, I have this study going on, and it is, or I have this idea for an engagement in this forest. How can I make multiple points of relevance to it? How can I make sure that I'm including things that are attracting the undergraduate population in this major and administrators in this respect and my colleagues over in this college? And to really be thinking about how, in the engagements that we already have going on, how can we start to bring in more points of relevance and then more diverse audiences from the university community from there? we can always think about one-off programs that can encourage more people in the forest, more voices to be heard in singular events. But I would start by thinking about how, with what you currently have going on, how can you really be thinking about attracting more people or more voices to that. And implicit in this is, I think, which was maybe your last question there, should it be part of the university experience? From my viewpoint, I say absolutely. This is a university resource. This is a place where, you know, students are maybe not having the fullest education possible if they are not introduced to at least one aspect of these places. And so really thinking through, how can this be complementary to this unique point in somebody's life where they are open to learning? It's their job to be learning about these places and in a really rich setting for that, and to be thinking about it as maybe a way to incorporate it in your specific courses, or in when you're looking more broadly at disciplines.
Very good. I'm going to note that we're coming up on an hour, and those of you who need to leave, we certainly understand. I'm going to extend the Q&A session with the permission of my panelists for another 15 minutes, because we've got a long list of questions. We're not going to get to them all. Bill, is that?
That's fine, absolutely.
Okay. So I have two questions here, one from Matt Barron, who is the chair of the UMass Extension Board of Public Overseers and works on the Massachusetts Forest Alliance, and another one from Jesse Miner at UMaine Farmington. And essentially, Matt's question is, are there specific sources of funding to do projects on school forests? And Jesse asked a complementary question, which is a question that I'm starting to look into at my campus, UMaine Farmington, is whether campus forests can be enrolled in carbon credit schemes. Have you run across that in your literature review or other research?
I do not know if any specific programs came up in the paper off the top of my head, but carbon is Bill's area of expertise, so maybe he can speak about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. In my experience, I would say that university-owned lands are eligible for enrollment in forest carbon projects under both compliance markets and voluntary market schemes. But there's some nuances here that are really important, which is that in both of those cases, to qualify for offsets, one has to demonstrate that one is making a meaningful change, and you're actually changing relative to what might have might have happened otherwise. So if there are restrictions in place already that governed how a forest would be managed or harvested in the future, those might actually preclude eligibility for enrollment in a carbon project. So the devil would be in the details in terms of commitments that a university has already made in terms of how a forest will be managed into the future. And to the extent that some forests might not have precluded future options, then those would be the ones that would be most eligible for participation in carbon projects. So that gets really complicated really quickly. The short answer is yes, in some cases.
Even just within UVM, Bill, it would be true that like Jericho has restrictions that might preclude it and other forests may not, correct?
Exactly, yes.
Let me take the moderator's prerogative to extend that a little bit. The converse situation is that many university administrators are not in love with the idea of making 40-year or 100-year commitments on the university properties. And they bring up questions of fiduciary responsibility and getting the best return on the university's assets. And so that becomes an issue that keeps them from getting involved in carbon credit schemes. But I also know that David Foster at the Harvard Forest has successfully been able to talk to administrators at his university and show them the long-term value of having an experimental forest to the whole mission of the university. And so the university is more willing now to make long-term commitments than it has been.
Yeah. A lot of universities are interested in counting their forests, against their carbon footprint, whether or not they're actually enrolled in a project and generating real offsets.
Yeah. Let me also say, and this is going to be the subject of a future webinar of Alpines, that Bill Keaton is pioneering carbon credit deals in Vermont in connection with the Vermont Land Trust, the Nature Conservancy, and other nonprofits. And so the know-how and the knowledge base that the university can bring to helping to let those carbon markets emerge is very important and very significant. I have a question here from Meenakshi Amundsen. I hope I pronounced your first name correctly. How are pre-European knowledge, use, and management practices of forests being integrated into the CES, as well as research and education and assessment of their value?
They would have been counted as a CES in our coding. And beyond that, I mean, for all the CES, we just coded for presence absence. And so they would have just been coded that way as a CES presence absence. I want to say there were, less than 5 papers total that brought up traditional ecological knowledge. May not have even been that many. So overall, I would say that, as a whole, CES were not reported on as much as the other ecosystem services. And then the ones that were just mentioned were probably the majority of the CES that were talked about were education focused. So the message there, I think, is sort of the same refrain that we've been saying, that if you are writing a paper and it's about traditional ecological knowledge and it is taking place on a school forest, please name the forest in that paper so that those two things then can be linked in the literature and sort of consumed by the forestry community, so that we are aware that these locations are important for those CES.
Okay. I'm going to take 3 more questions. Bess, do you want to add to that at all, or are you all set?
I was just gonna say that, I think beyond our paper, yes, if there were ways in which indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, any of those viewpoints were expressed, we captured that in the papers that we received. However, I think that there's opportunity more broadly, of course, for these viewpoints and for these frameworks and for these knowledge systems to be incorporated into discussions of CES. And I think that those of us who look at CES are open to that. And so I would just encourage researchers that, if that is something that you are looking at, not to shy away from having that be explicitly mentioned in the paper, and especially in regards to these oftentimes complicated histories of school forests and how we might be thinking about diversifying how we even think about the resources.
Yeah, I can add, I know, for instance, in Montana, the University of Montana and the Blackfeet Nation are working together very closely on present day management of open spaces, both forests and non-forested areas, using indigenous knowledge and indigenous talent today. So that does exist in many parts of the world, and I think is a growing field of interest. Back to the financing theme, J.T. Horn, who many of you know, who is from the upper valley of the Connecticut River, asks, in regard to conserving university forests, do you believe that administrators are aware that the land trust community can pay for a conservation easement and so be a revenue source? And let me elaborate to say that I think what JT is referring to is that the university could retain ownership of the forest and perhaps retain research usages of the forest, but that revenue could come from the university from the sale of an easement that limits development on those forests.
I think it's probably variable by school. I don't know that I have a universal answer. Bill and Bess, do you have a response?
I think it's generally true that universities are aware, and most universities have, some kind of a physical planning or lands, committee or arm that certainly works closely with land trusts. But I think that the ability to act on a specific project proposal or parcel is so context specific. Sometimes universities are prepared to do so, other times not. And it's the conservation easements help, but it's not the whole picture. There's the long-term, the tax burden and responsibility that of ownership and management and everything else that the universities are not always willing to assume. So it really often depends on the specific project. But yeah, but in general, I think what you're trying to say is really important, and that these partnerships with land trusts are critical in many cases to make these transactions happen.
All right, 2 more questions, and I think we will run out of time, although I will say that there's a very engaged audience out there that's asking lots of questions that we can't get to at this point, but you've certainly struck a nerve that I think a lot of people are interested in. We have a question, we have 2 questions, but I'll read one of them from Jennifer Ramstetter, who asks, in terms of inclusive practices and relevant connections, do you have any suggestions or information on including the BIPOC community in forest conservation efforts? And Black, Indigenous, and people of color is how I would translate BIPOC.
So I actually was really hoping that Kim might say something about Rochelle Gould's research in this area. Have you worked with her on the New Americans and the Vermont Refugee Relief Program, and trying to understand their interests and connections to research forests?
Yeah, so I can say a little bit about that project, and then Bess also has done quite a bit of work on increasing relevance to BIPOC communities in the national parks. So I'll let her speak as well. I'll just say that I think that we could have a whole webinar on this topic, and I don't think that anybody would be surprised to learn that the audience of forest relevance and outdoor recreation more broadly is majority white, right? And so we have a lot of work to do. And yeah, so Bill is referencing a project that was part of this McIntyre-Studness project, actually, that spurred this paper that my PI, when I was a postdoc, led. So folks could look up Rochelle Gould and Tatiana Glatkick's work. And it's really looking at what elements of forests close to UVM, the resettled refugee populations, found relevance in, and it has a lot to do with the aforementioned topic of traditional ecological knowledge and around foraging and around finding some of the same plants that folks were used to in their home countries in forests here, and how sort of that connection could be deepened, and how foraging could be made easier for people, how access could be made easier, so that the relevance could be deepened even more. So I think that there's not one answer to that question. There are a lot of ways that we could and should and need to build relevance with BIPOC communities, and hopefully we're all individually taking steps in that direction. I'll let Bess answer a little bit about what the Park Service has been doing or is continuing to work on, because I think it's applicable, even though these aren't parks, right? There's a lot of similarities.
Yeah, I think that all of these approaches, all of these ways are important and meaningful. I don't want to focus too much exactly on the Park Service right now with our limited time, but I do want to hint that the way of making meaningful connections is to both truly understand the audience and incorporate their perspectives. And a lot of times that is so hard for a manager, for a researcher to do without having those strong connections to a community. And whether this is any type of community, but of course, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in particular, when we talk about some of these aspects of marginalization, we really want to be attuned to that and really that integration of perspectives. Kim mentioned about the traditional ecological knowledge. I want to focus in on the CES. Within cultural ecosystem services, there are many researchers, myself included, who really focus in on recreation. And we see recreation being highlighted as the one that has the most prominence within cultural ecosystem services and the most, and we have all sorts of ways that we're trying to help diversify our recreationist base. However, there are at least 9 other recognized cultural ecosystem services, and these ones may have more tangents of connection to particular communities. So I would say that, when you're looking at a particular community, we really need to think about what matters to that community and what matters beyond just recreation. We have all sorts of practices for and ways that we're trying to make recreation more inclusive, but maybe it's advertising the spiritual connection in the forest, that these places can be places of family bonding, that they may be places for you to sit and do your journaling or your artistic inspiration, and maybe have the family bonding at the same time. There are all these ways that we can think about the benefits of forest that go beyond putting on hiking boots as well.
I think
And
in COVID times, we're all reminded of the relevance of that. I know that we have a Massachusetts Audubon Sanctuary across the street from where I live, and the parking lots are just full on the weekends, even on freezing cold weekends, of families wanting to be outside with their kids and be in nature. So that's something that I think is very apparent to a lot of people.
the Gund Institute just released a study showing, just as you say, Jim, this newly appreciated significance that open space of all sorts, including school forests, has taken on in the COVID era, in places where people are just desperately in need of outdoor recreation and open space. I'll just comment really quickly on the BIPOC question, because it's such an important one and yet so challenging. I mean, this touches on really deep systemic issues that we would have to grapple with, like, for example, the lack of diversity in forestry programs, where the BIPOC population isn't participating in research forests because many of the programs of students that we're taking out to these forests are themselves not diverse, and then so we need to think about the Society of American Foresters and the profession and these other, again, really deep systemic issues in terms of, increasing representation out there. So there's so much that we could talk about.
I just wanted to put in one final note here, and it's about the understanding the ways that we can do conservation easements on these places, understanding the communities that interact with them, and that's that we took this initial foray into looking at school forests. We are so interested in looking at forest management plans, at different ways that forests are communicating with different audiences, and taking this look: how are people of color being involved in these programs? How are we looking at conservation easements? How are we looking at student engagement? I saw a question about K through 12. That's an awesome one as well. And to really take another perspective on that. And so we have people who are interested. We have their emails from attending this webinar, and I can be following up kind of as we start to get thoughts in order. But if this is a topic that continues to interest you, that you continue to find questions on, we would love to probe this further.
All right. We are at time. I just want to thank Bess and Kim and Bill for an outstanding presentation. I want to thank the audience for great questions. I think that with the twin crises of COVID and climate change, we are just going to see more and more of that interest and very useful research being done to begin to answer those questions. So with great respect and appreciation for the work that they are doing, and hopeful anticipation for the work that they will do, thanks to the three of you for putting on such a great presentation today. And we will be back with another Alpine webinar, very likely in the month of April. We appreciate all of your effort in making this network continue to grow. and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.